So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the second speaker, Professor Myles Allen. Myles is the Professor of Geosystem Science, the School of Geography and the Environment and the Department of Physics. He's the Director of the Oxford Net Zero Program and lead author of the 1.5 degrees report.
Headphones.
An incredibly wonderful person, I'm pleased to say. So very happy to have Myles join us here on the stage. Thank you, Myles.
Thank you very much, Matt, and thank you very much indeed to the China Corporate Pavilion for giving us the chance to talk to you today. I'm going to be taking, can I just sort of double check with the folks on Zoom, maybe if somebody's tracking Zoom here.
It's gone now.
Audio as well. Yep. Great, so I'm taking a rather different take to, actually it's a very complementary take, but looking at a very different part of the problem to the problem that Matt was talking about. This is a backstop policy, which Matt gave a very good sort of segue, a good link between our two talks, when he pointed out that the transition that he was describing reduced global emissions by roughly 2/3, maybe a bit more, maybe 3/4, between now and 2050, but didn't get it all the way to net zero. And of course, the fundamental thing we're addressing, which I'm very happy seems to be very widely acknowledged in this COP, is we've got to get to net zero by mid-century or not long thereafter if we're going to meet our climate goals. So this is sort of those integrated assessment models that Matt was rightly having a go at. This is what they tell you, but the overall picture, although for emissions ends up quite similar. These are the sort of ambitious integrated assessment model scenarios that meet the Paris Agreement goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. You can see that if you just sort of take an average of the technology neutral scenarios in the latest IPCC assessment, this shows you the total carbon dioxide produced in black from energy and industry, and then net emissions to the atmosphere in blue. And of course, the huge gray wedge there is the total carbon that is re-injected back underground. So this is the carbon sequestered through a combination of either capture at point sources or recapture from the atmosphere through BECCS or other direct air capture technologies in these scenarios. So the important points to stress in this is that in order to meet our climate goals, we clearly have to produce less CO2. That's the first thing we need to be doing in the short term, but we also need to store more CO2. And that's the part of the picture which isn't happening on anything like the scale it needs to happen at the moment. You could argue that both sides of that coin need attention, but driving up CO2 storage is an area of particular concern to me, because if you look at what's been happening over the past couple of decades, it's been very slow. And people jump on that to say there's something fundamentally wrong with the principle or the technologies and say, oh, CCS will never happen because it hasn't happened yet. My response to that is I think the reason carbon capture and storage has made so little progress over the past couple of decades is actually nothing to do with the technology at all, and everything to do with the fact that we've got the policy environment wrong in terms of how we incentivize it. So we tend to think of carbon capture in this way. This is a figure from a recent Goldman report showing the sort of typical way in which people think about how to reduce emissions. And it's all about comparing the costs of different points on what they call the marginal abatement cost curve. And this shows you in the horizontal greenhouse gas emissions abatement. So how much can we reduce emissions by deploying different technologies, by doing different measures? And Matt will no doubt complain that some of the points on this curve are at the wrong height because they're using outdated estimates of PV, although I think Goldman actually used rather better estimates than more realistic estimates than some of the integrated assessment models. But the main point about this figure is that it distinguishes between measures to reduce CO2 production in red. So those would be the cost of replacing coal with PV, that Matt was talking about, or the costs of improving the energy efficiency of our energy system, and then measures to increase CO2 storage in blue. Now, remember in the previous figure, we need to do both, but what you notice is consistently up to about 75% of our, it's all good, up to about 75% of the emission reductions. So down to that point where Matt was saying you could get to with that fast transition to PV, it's cheaper to reduce production than it is to increase storage. But then after that, reducing production, the cost of reducing production goes through the roof. And so that final 25% of emissions, most of which are not directly in part of the electricity, certainly not part of the electricity generation sector, but they're the sort of hard to abate activities that we've been talking about a lot in this COP. Those are the ones where increasing storage looks to be potentially the answer to dealing with those final emissions. So that sort of crossover in the Goldman analysis, and I'm sure there's other analyses possible, comes at around 75% of emissions. That's why at that point, it becomes more cost effective to get rid of the CO2 back underground than it does to change or avoid the activity that generates the CO2 in the first place. The other challenge, of course, that engineered disposal of CO2, putting CO2 back underground faces, is that there's many cheaper options. By the way, I'm very happy to share my slides. I think Matt, we'll put them up on the side afterwards. So if people want to follow this as well, that's also possible. You'll see that this slide distinguishes so-called nature-based or sort of partly nature-based options for increasing CO2 storage in green with engineered solutions in blue. And the engineered solutions primarily involve putting the carbon dioxide back underground or turning it back into rocks in some way. And you'll notice that over on the left, there's quite a few big chunks of opportunities for nature-based CO2 storage, afforestation, agroforestry, and so forth. Now, the difficulty, so what that means is, you know, for the next decade or so, it may well be that even if we accept the need to increase CO2 storage, we'll go for the cheaper versions of CO2 storage. We'll just deploy more nature-based solutions and still won't move on to the engineered solutions that we will need in the end. There are lots of low-cost opportunities for nature-based climate solutions. I can't stress that enough, but I also need to remind you that trees take time to grow. And there was a paper published just recently, led by Cécile Girardin, where we looked at the temperature impact of the most optimistic estimates out there of the potential of nature-based climate solutions. And we found they could shave about 1/10 of a degree off global temperatures by mid-century. Now, just to remind you, 1/10 of a degree is roughly what global temperatures have gone up since the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015. So they can help, but they're not going to provide the whole answer to stopping fossil fuels from causing global warming. There's also, of course, the really worrying trend, the really problematic trend, which is that the carbon stores in the biosphere are increasingly vulnerable to climate change itself. If we store fossil carbon in trees, it is vulnerable as the world warms to going back into the atmosphere. So if we want to stop fossil fuels from causing global warming, we need to get to the point where we're storing back underground 1 ton of carbon dioxide for every ton produced by continued use of fossil fuels. This is just maths. It's not a policy statement. That's what it's going to take. And this is taking one of those integrated assessment models. There was even dramatic music off. I hope you could hear it online when I made that important statement. Okay, so to get to this point, in one of those IAM scenarios, you can see, you know, the reductions that happen, and we can frame this picture in a rather different way, which is, I think, the way we should be thinking about this. And this is the way, if you take nothing away from you, take this single point, we need to start thinking about in our policies, possibly even, dare I say it, in our NDCs, giving the incredibly useful information of what fraction of carbon dioxide that is still produced by burning fossil fuels is being disposed of back underground. Right now, globally, this fraction is less than 0.1%. Okay, most of that happening, by the way, in the United States, some in, some in Australia, some, so not in the places you might expect, but there is some carbon dioxide going back under the Earth's crust, but it's axiomatic that that fraction has to be 100% for us to achieve a durable net zero economy. So we need to start monitoring it. We don't even know what it is. We don't know what this fraction's doing. We don't know what it is in the collective NDCs submitted for 2030. It would be great to know, because if we look at these scenarios, it goes up. Obviously, it goes up. It has to get to 100%. It has to increase if it's going to get there. In cost-effective scenarios that reach net zero by 2050, it's around 10% by 2030. I don't know what it is in the NDCs because it's not reported, but I can assure you it's not 10%. So we need to start monitoring this fraction. And just to remind you what the fraction is I'm talking about, it's the fraction of carbon dioxide produced by burning fossil fuels, with the fraction of that carbon dioxide that is put back underground or permanently disposed of. Matt was emphasizing this, but I'm just going to re-emphasize it. In conventional integrated assessment models, these reductions in emissions and increases in storage come about because of very, very high demand management measures, which are here modeled by an effective global carbon price. And if you look at the numbers there, that equivalent carbon price in this model, I've picked one out, it's the EASA message model, but you could look at any of the others, you get a very similar picture. I'm not singling out EASA for particular sort of poking here. You need a carbon price in excess of $1,000 per ton of CO2 to actually drive emissions all the way to net zero. Now, that should puzzle you, because $1,000 per ton of CO2 is more than the cost of capturing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and burying it back underground, even today, never mind in 2050. So why do the models seem to think that we need such very, very high carbon prices in order to get us all the way to net zero? Well, the answer, when we look at in detail, and Stuart Jenkins, I obviously should have emphasized at the beginning of this talk, I'm really presenting on behalf of Stuart Jenkins. This is work that he's recently published in a paper in Joule. And the reason he found that these integrated assessment models end up with these very, very high carbon prices is that the modelers assume that we don't build the plant to get rid of carbon dioxide fast enough. So there's a hard limit in the models at how fast we deploy carbon capture and storage. And that's imposed by the modelers. It's insensitive to the carbon price at these very high ambition scenarios. And that's what we want to challenge. How can we ensure that we deploy CO2 storage fast enough that we don't end up in this, what I would call a nightmare scenario of requiring carbon prices of $1,000 a ton of CO2. Just to remind you, the carbon price that brought out the Gilets jaunes onto the streets of Paris was an increase, I think, of equivalent less than well under $10 per ton of CO2. Okay, that was the increase that basically almost brought down the government of France. Now we're talking about an increase of 100 times that. Sorry, I'm not very good at mental arithmetic when I'm on screen. And somehow that's seen as a low risk transition scenario. It's not. That kind of heavy demand reduction measures is high risk. People need to acknowledge that. So what's an alternative? Well, this is what I'd like to talk to you about in the last 10 minutes of my talk. I want to introduce you to the idea of a carbon takeback obligation. So suppose, just imagine, instead of relying on a carbon price to drive down emissions and eventually drive up storage, you actually introduce a requirement on anyone introducing fossil carbon into the world economy or into a subset of the world economy, like China, for example, or a group of countries in Europe, or even a buyer's cartel like the world's airlines. That would be another possible sort of carbon bubble you could define to say, and we're going to require, and this group could require that anyone selling fossil fuels into that group has to ensure that a certain fraction of the fossil fuels they sell, of the CO2 embedded in the fossil fuels they sell, is geologically sequestered, permanently disposed of. Now, we know where we want to get to. We want to get to 100% storage by 2050. So it's very easy to work out what you need to do on the way. We need to be at roughly 10% by 2030, 50% by 2040, 100% by 2050. That would be a fair, smooth transition to 100% storage. So again, it's a very simple requirement. Get rid of 10% of the carbon dioxide generated by the fossil fuels you sell by 2030, and you're on a path to decarbonizing your fuels by 2050. Importantly, we allow, in this hypothetical policy, the fossil fuel provider to source their CO2 from any CO2 they can find that would otherwise have ended up in the atmosphere. That's important because it means you don't have to jump to the very expensive direct air capture technologies immediately. You can start off by deploying CO2 storage on point sources, which is significantly cheaper in the short term. So just to take you through how this works, the current situation is we have an extractor of fossil fuels selling carbon dioxide. The blue lines sort of represent embedded carbon to industrial point sources who make products, pass them on to consumers, and all the CO2 ends up in the atmosphere. So, you know, the industrial point sources, they're probably having ETS measures imposed on them. So they're not particularly happy, but you know, they're getting along. Consumers are happy. They haven't really noticed climate policy. The atmosphere is sweating. It's terrible for the atmosphere. The world is warming very fast. The geological storage operator is very sad because nobody is talking to them. They have no incentive to get rid of CO2. The government is asleep. It's not doing anything. And the fossil fuel extractor is just laughing. They're making ridiculous amounts of money at the moment, and they will continue to do so. And that, in fact, that was going to be my question for Matt, and maybe we can get back to this at the questions, is what does the fossil fuel industry do when it starts to face serious competition from renewables? Given the level of their rents at the moment, given the size of profits when you add up the profits and the royalties and so on in the fossil fuel industry, they've got a lot of firepower to fight back when the pressure from renewables really comes on. So what can we do to sort of correct this? Well, introduce a carbon takeback obligation. The government actually does something. It tells the extractor to pay the geological storage operator to start to bury CO2. And the first thing the geological storage operator is going to do is buy that CO2 from some industrial point source. And the pink lines here show some payments. So, you know, the industrial point source is maybe a little less unhappy because they're now getting paid for their CO2. So that's a good new income source for them. The consumers haven't noticed because it's only a small fraction of the CO2 that's required initially. So it's a very low cost. So they're still happily consuming away. The atmosphere is still sweating, I'm afraid. There's still a lot of CO2 going into the atmosphere because the policy's only just started. The geological storage operator, of course, is a lot happier because they now have some business. The government is getting serious. And the extractor importer is kind of annoyed because suddenly they have to do something that they didn't have to do before. But it's high time they stepped up to the plate and actually started to engage with helping solve the climate problem that their products have caused. So as we ramp up the storage obligation, this is sort of later on in the 2030s, 2040s, the amount we're storing goes up. We start to run out of storage available from point sources, and somebody has to set up some air capture to supplement that CO2 to ensure that there's enough CO2 going to the geological storage operator in order to deliver sort of 50% storage to the extractor so that they can keep extracting. Remember, this is a licensing requirement on the extractor that they have to show these certificates of CO2 storage if they're going to continue to bring fossil carbon into the economy. So there you are. The industrial point sources haven't changed very much. The atmosphere is starting to feel a bit better because the flow of CO2 into the atmosphere is slowing down. The geological storage operator by this time is doing really well because they've got a lot of business coming from all sorts of directions. The government's feeling pretty good, and the extractors may be starting to calm down a bit because, you know, at the end of the day, they're realizing they now have a long-term business model selling fossil carbon without destroying the planet. So finally, we get to 100% stored fraction. This is the scenario in 2050. You've got the same amount of CO2 going back underground as is coming out. It's being paid for by the extractors. Costs are being passed on, of course, but industrial point sources now have a new business, which they would have not had if they were just simply, threatened with an ETS type system. Consumers are happy because they're still consuming. The atmosphere is breathing a sigh of relief because global warming has stopped. And the geological storage operator remains very happy. The government feels completely awesome because it stopped climate change. And the extractor importer, from being the devil in the picture, now has a little halo over the head because they are the ones who've actually stopped the world from warming up. So that's the carbon take-back scenario. And just to point out to you the rather surprising economics of this, if you think about what this actually costs in terms of embedded costs passed on to the consumer, and let's assume all the costs are passed on and we don't actually see any costs being absorbed into the reduced profits or royalties of the fossil fuel industry, it's equivalent, you know, when you're only imposing a 1% sequestration requirement to a carbon price of less than around 50 cents a ton of CO2. So it's invisible. Of course, by the time you get to all 100% air capture costs, it's up at the cost of 100% air capture, sort of around $300 a ton or so, very possibly lower if people like Tim can drive the cost down to a fraction of that. But this is a sort of pessimistic estimate of air capture costs that we've used in our modeling. So what Stuart did in his paper, and what was really, we've been proposing this idea, Stuart Hazeldine and I, for a decade now, and made relatively little progress because people have always been concerned that it might drive up costs of fossil energy too quickly and have a negative impact on competitiveness or the economy. So in this paper, we really wanted to address this straight on. We modeled the implications of a carbon take-back obligation in an integrated assessment model. And we found, first of all, a very interesting result, which is that if you just impose the carbon take-back obligation, if that's your total climate policy, it has a strange problem, an unusual problem for a climate policy, which gets you to net zero by 2050, which this one does, is it's too cheap. Because initially, you're only sequestering a fraction of the carbon dioxide generated by your continued use of fossil fuels. This means that people don't reduce consumption of fossil fuels. They carry on generating CO2, and then you're left with a very big bill to drive to sequester all the remaining carbon in order to get to net zero by 2050. So we can correct that by introducing, instead of $1,000 a ton carbon prices in 2050, we can introduce $100 a ton carbon price. So just enough to nudge down demand in the short term, and that gets us onto a 1.5 degree consistent path. So the take home of all this is that if we introduced a carbon take-back obligation now, it would reduce the risk of deployment barriers, both economic and non-economic, preventing the scale up of carbon capture at the speed we need to scale it up to meet our climate goals and achieve net zero by mid-century. It is a regulatory measure. It's very different, and it's an upstream regulatory measure. So it's a very simple measure to implement on the fossil fuel industry, which is already a very highly regulated industry. And if it was implemented alongside conventional demand-side mitigation measures, it would allow us to meet the Paris climate goals at no significant additional cost, complementing all the work on renewables and fossil fuel deployment that Matt was talking about. So we need both sides of this story to meet our goal. Thank you.